Elena Cross trusted people with their darkest secrets, and Marcus Hale built his life around erasing people without a trace. When their paths crossed, humanity itself became the final victim. The case began in a place no one paid attention to anymore. At the far edge of the city stood an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by weeds and broken pavement. It had once been part of a busy industrial zone, but time had emptied it of purpose. Early one morning, a faint smell of smoke drifted across the area, not sharp or urgent, but old and heavy, as if the fire had already finished its work. When authorities arrived, they found the building sealed tight. The doors were locked from the inside, and the windows were covered. Inside, the air was thick with ash and silence. What they discovered did not look like a normal crime scene. The fire had been controlled, limited to specific areas, as though someone had carefully decided what should burn and what should remain. There was no panic frozen into the space. No overturned furniture. No signs of chaos. At the center of the warehouse lay the body of a woman, positioned in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. She was later identified as Elena Cross, a local volunteer known for her work with families in crisis. Her life, by all accounts, had been quiet and generous. Investigators immediately felt unsettled. Crimes usually carried emotion. Anger left marks. Fear caused disorder. This place had neither. Everything felt planned, almost respectful in its arrangement, which made it far more disturbing. The fire damage avoided key structural points, as if the person responsible wanted the scene preserved. It was clear this was not an act of desperation. It was an act of control. As word spread, the city reacted with disbelief. Elena had no criminal record, no public enemies, and no history of risky behavior. She lived alone, followed a strict routine, and was deeply trusted by those she helped. Neighbors described her as careful and kind. That description only deepened the mystery. People began to ask how someone like her could end up in such a place, at such an end. The warehouse offered few answers. Security cameras in the area had been disabled hours before the fire, not damaged but quietly disconnected. No witnesses came forward. No nearby businesses reported unusual activity. It was as if the event had been erased before it even happened. Forensic teams found traces of accelerant, but nothing excessive. The message was clear. This was never meant to be a spectacle. As the investigation continued, a chilling thought took shape. Elena may not have been forced into the warehouse. There were no signs of restraint, no evidence of struggle. This suggested trust. Someone she believed in. Someone who knew how to approach her without raising alarm. That possibility shifted the case into darker territory. The city changed after that. People checked on loved ones more often. Volunteers questioned their own safety. The idea that kindness could be used as a doorway to something so cruel lingered in every conversation. From the very first day, investigators understood this case was not about impulse or rage. It was about intention. And whatever mind had planned it was still out there, unseen, untouched, and patient. The second phase of the investigation moved away from the warehouse and into Elena Cross's life. Investigators began by rebuilding her final weeks, hour by hour. At first, everything appeared normal. She went to work, volunteered in the evenings, and kept regular contact with the same small circle of people. But beneath that steady routine, gaps slowly appeared. Her phone records showed long periods of activity followed by complete silence. Messages were missing, not just deleted, but wiped in a way that suggested planning. Someone had taken time to remove pieces of her story. Her computer told a similar tale. Email folders were empty, yet the system logs confirmed heavy use. Files had been accessed and erased days before her death. Financial records added another layer of concern. Small amounts of money had been transferred from her account to unfamiliar digital wallets. None of the transfers were large enough to trigger alarms, but together they formed a pattern. It felt like preparation, as if someone had been clearing obstacles in advance. Investigators focused on Elena's volunteer work. She supported people trying to leave dangerous situations, often helping them relocate quietly. This work required trust and discretion. It also placed her in contact with individuals who wanted to remain invisible. That fact raised troubling questions. Had someone from this hidden world turned on her? Or had someone else been watching from the shadows, learning how her work operated? The timeline of the night she died became the center of attention. Traffic cameras showed her car driving toward the warehouse district without hesitation. There was no sign of pursuit, no sudden change in direction. This suggested she knew where she was going. The idea that Elena entered the warehouse by choice changed the entire direction of the case. If she had trusted the wrong person, then the crime was not just violent but deeply personal. More unsettling details emerged. Security systems near the warehouse had been shut down cleanly. No wires were cut. No alarms were triggered. Only someone familiar with the area or someone who had studied it carefully could have done that. This pointed away from random violence and toward calculated intent. The person responsible did not rush. They planned. As these details became public, fear spread quietly. Volunteers questioned their safety. People who depended on Elena's help wondered if they were also being watched. The idea that someone could hide behind a normal appearance and exploit systems meant to protect others made the case feel larger than one death. Investigators began to believe Elena's kindness had made her vulnerable. Her willingness to help without suspicion may have allowed someone dangerous to get close. That realization weighed heavily on the team. This was no longer just about finding a killer. It was about understanding how someone could manipulate trust so completely. By the end of this stage, the case had taken on a darker shape. The crime was not loud or chaotic. It was quiet, precise, and patient. And somewhere behind the erased messages and missing data was a person who believed they could disappear just as cleanly as the evidence they left behind. The turning point came from a detail that had been dismissed during the first days of the investigation. Among the ashes in the warehouse, investigators had recovered a damaged access card. At first, it seemed useless, warped by heat and nearly unreadable. But after careful restoration, a partial identification number emerged. That number was traced to a logistics company that had shut down years earlier under quiet and unexplained circumstances. The company no longer existed, but its records remained archived, forgotten and untouched. Digging into those records revealed a strange pattern. Several former employees had vanished from public life after the company closed. They had not been reported missing. Their bank accounts were closed properly. Their digital identities faded without alarms. It was as if they had stepped away from existence in an orderly fashion. One name connected these disappearances to Elena's work. Each of those individuals had once received assistance from organizations she supported. The connection was too precise to ignore. One former employee stood out more than the others. Marcus Hale had worked as a systems analyst, responsible for digital security and internal access controls. After the company's shutdown, he withdrew completely. No social presence. No stable address. Only fragments of short-term work under different names. His skill set matched what investigators were seeing. The erased data, the disabled cameras, the clean financial movements all pointed toward someone who understood systems deeply and knew how to move through them without leaving noise. A search warrant led investigators to a neglected apartment listed under a false identity. Inside, they found something far more disturbing than expected. The space was empty of comfort. No personal photos. No decorations. Just shelves of neatly organized boxes. Each box contained personal items belonging to different people. None of the items had obvious value. Keys, notebooks, identification cards, watches. Everything was labeled with dates and locations. It was a record, not a collection. Digital storage devices recovered from the apartment revealed detailed files. These were not confessions or emotional writings. They were observations, schedules, movement patterns, notes about trust, routines, and weaknesses. Elena's name appeared among them, along with careful notes about her habits and volunteer work. It became clear she had been watched long before the night she died. The most chilling realization was that Elena was not the first. She was simply the moment where control failed. The evidence suggested Marcus believed people could be removed from society quietly if done correctly. No panic. No attention. just absence. His actions were guided by logic stripped of empathy. The case was no longer about one murder. It was about a hidden system built on erasing lives. Investigators understood they were facing something rare and deeply unsettling. This was not driven by anger, jealousy, or desperation. It was driven by belief. A belief that humanity could be sorted, managed, and reduced without consequence. As they closed in on Marcus, the fear was not whether he had stopped. It was how long he had been doing this without anyone noticing at all. Authorities moved quickly once Marcus Hale became the center of the investigation. Using fragments of digital activity, they tracked a pattern of short-term jobs that required night work and minimal personal information. These positions allowed him to exist without scrutiny, blending into spaces where people avoided questions. He had lived like a shadow, always temporary, always forgettable. Eventually, investigators located him in a remote coastal town, working alone in a facility that processed shipments after midnight. The place was quiet, isolated, and perfectly suited to someone who wanted to remain unseen. When the location was searched, the scale of what they uncovered exceeded expectations. Storage units rented under different identities were found nearby. Inside, each unit contained sealed containers stacked with the same methodical precision seen in his apartment. More personal belongings appeared, each labeled and dated. Some items belonged to people whose families believed they had simply moved away. Others belonged to individuals no one had noticed were gone. The realization settled heavily over the investigation. These were not isolated acts. They were part of a long, deliberate pattern. Documents recovered from the units revealed detailed plans written in plain, technical language. There was no emotion in the writing. Each step was broken down as if it were a routine task. Schedules mapped out movement, access points, and contingency options. Elena's case was marked differently, noted as a necessary correction. Investigators struggled to understand the logic behind that phrase, but psychological experts later suggested it reflected a belief system where human value was calculated rather than felt. What disturbed experts most was the absence of chaos in Marcus's thinking. There were no signs of impulsivity or emotional breakdown. Everything pointed to control. He selected people who lived on the edges of visibility, individuals whose disappearance would not raise alarms. Elena represented a risk to that system. Her work disrupted the quiet removal of people by reconnecting them to support networks. In his mind, she was an obstacle. As news of these discoveries reached the public, fear spread beyond the city where the case began. The idea that someone could operate undetected for years challenged the sense of safety people relied on. This was not a predator driven by rage. It was someone who believed order mattered more than life. The case forced authorities to examine gaps in social systems, where people could vanish without triggering concern. Marcus was taken into custody without resistance. There was no attempt to flee, no visible reaction. That calm response only deepened the unease surrounding him. Experts later described his behavior as detached to an extreme degree, marked by a complete absence of empathy. He viewed his actions as efficient solutions rather than crimes. By the end of this phase, investigators understood they were confronting something beyond a single offender. The case exposed how silence, isolation, and neglected systems could allow cruelty to grow unnoticed. What had begun as one tragic discovery now stood as evidence of a hidden pattern of harm that had quietly existed for years, waiting for one mistake to bring it into the light. The final chapter of the case unfolded in a courtroom filled with a tension that never fully lifted. By the time the trial began, investigators had pieced together years of hidden activity, each step supported by evidence that left little room for doubt. The prosecution laid out a timeline showing how Marcus Hale had carefully constructed a life designed to avoid notice, using his technical skills to erase traces and manipulate systems meant to protect people. The evidence did not rely on emotion or dramatic moments. It relied on patterns, records, and the quiet consistency of his actions. Experts explained how his mindset differed from that of most violent offenders. He was not driven by anger, jealousy, or desperation. Instead, he operated from a belief that people could be evaluated like data. Those who lived unnoticed could be removed without consequence. Elena Cross became central to the case because her work challenged that belief. By helping vulnerable individuals rebuild their lives, she disrupted the invisible paths Marcus depended on. Her death was not random. It was intentional and symbolic within his distorted logic. As the full scope of the evidence was revealed, the public began to understand why the case had been described as defying humanity. The absence of emotion, the deliberate planning, and the years of unnoticed harm created a picture that felt deeply unsettling. This was not evil expressed through chaos or rage. It was evil expressed through calm calculation. The courtroom became a place where people confronted the uncomfortable truth that cruelty does not always look monstrous. The verdict brought accountability, but it did not bring peace. Families of those affected learned that their loved ones had not simply disappeared by choice. Systems that failed to notice patterns of absence came under intense scrutiny. Authorities admitted that the case exposed weaknesses in how society tracks and protects those living on the margins. New policies were proposed to improve oversight and communication between aid organizations and law enforcement. Elena's name remained at the center of these changes. Her work, once quiet and unrecognized, became a symbol of resistance against hidden harm. Programs were renamed in her honor, and her methods of support were studied to strengthen future protections. Though she could not be brought back, her impact reached far beyond her life. In the end, the case left a lasting mark. It showed that the most frightening crimes are not always loud or violent. Sometimes they are silent, methodical, and hidden behind ordinary routines. The story served as a warning that humanity can be challenged not only by hatred, but by indifference. And it reminded the world that paying attention, even to those who seem invisible, can be the difference between safety and tragedy.